you? Hard going?
Yeah.
Good, easy, familiar? Was it very new to either of you, for example? Or was it stuff you had a connection with from before?
A connection, but yeah, still quite a lot to do.
Yeah. Fair enough. So had either of you read Recur before this week?
No.
Okay, new guy. We will, can't spell. We will work together to make sense of him and put him in context. And you've just been reading Marion with David,
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think Recur's easier than Marion. We'll see if you guys agree. I know you guys normally get a code for attendance. The system doesn't appear to have produced one today, but I will double check now in case it's come in the last hour or so. The eternal extra security to get to my own teaching materials. Yes. Okay. Okay. Sorry for all the layers of setup, guys. Hopefully you're using this as a chance to get really familiar with Recur. What I'm going to do is do a bit of introduction to Recur and his work to put it in context, and particularly to explain how the texts we've been reading fit in. I know I've given you structured reading questions and you may have some thoughts in relation to those, but I'm mostly just interested in using our time to really look at these texts to see what they tell us about this thing we're calling philosophy of religion, and see what you make of it. So we may just end up using our time to do a kind of close reading of each of these texts, depending on what you find you are most interested in. But what I will do is record a little section that is kind of introducing Recur along with the PowerPoints, hence why I've set all of this up. I'm just going to come around here so that I can see the PowerPoint at the same time as looking at you guys. I'm not just giving you my back all the way through. Okay, so neither of you have read Ricoeur before. Had you heard of him before? Had you come across his name even? Okay. This is where I get really evangelical about how great Ricoeur is. Okay, we're looking at Paul Ricoeur, and I've subtitled this The Hermeneutic Turn. That is something that describes Ricoeur's own philosophy, but also something that is going on in philosophy of religion and in philosophy more broadly, especially in France, in the mid-20th century, sort of post-World War II. And that's where Ricoeur is coming in. That's him. I generally introduce Ricoeur as the most cheerful French philosopher you'll ever encounter. My boss once said to me, "Isn't he the only cheerful French philosopher?" And that's, you guys can decide that one for yourself. But yeah, he's a hopeful French philosopher, as we'll see. So that's Ricoeur.
So I'm guessing he's still 2000. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's perfect. Please do interject, especially if I say anything that needs further explanation. Hi, no worries. Perfect timing. I was engrossed in technology. We're just meeting Ricoeur. This is him. And yeah, as I said, if you have questions as I go, do interject. As you said, yeah, we lost Ricoeur in 2005. So I'm going to do some biographical stuff, which isn't always useful or important, but I think it is for Ricoeur because it tells us a bit about why he's interested in what he's interested in. So, born 1913, died 2005, orphaned at a very young age. His mother died before he was 3, and his father died in the military in World War I. So he's raised by his grandparents and by an aunt. Huguenot family, that's relevant because people tend to assume that Ricoeur is influenced by Catholicism, but he's not. He's actually Protestant, and that's quite important for how he treats scripture in particular. Now, from there, Ricoeur, in my view, becomes one of the most significant philosophers of the 20th century. And I think his influence is only growing. So your visual help for this is this book. This is the bibliography of Paul Ricoeur. It was published in 2008, 2009, so it's very out of date. And all it is a list of things Ricoeur has written and have been translated into other languages, and the secondary bibliography of what's been written about him. That was, 15 years ago? And it's already that thick. So he is a substantial philosopher at the very least. So this was edited by Frans van Sina and Peter van der Kasteel. It's 1.5 inches thick for those who are listening from home. So the breadth and reach of Ricoeur's work really shouldn't be underestimated. But in English-speaking contexts, there is sometimes a tendency to encounter Ricoeur's work only through narrow windows. So theologians encounter his stuff on biblical interpretation and are ignorant of the rest of his work. Or historians know his historiographic work and not his early phenomenology. Ricoeur's work is across many philosophical disciplines and across many philosophical questions. But what I will suggest is that his philosophy is always seeking to understand what it means to be human and for humans to live together. So it will often have this entry point into the ethical or the political. And I mention that now because that is not surprising given the early biographical details that I have mentioned. So he's orphaned in the context of war. And now early in his own philosophical work, so in perhaps the 1930s, he was deeply engaged in the community around the thinker Gabriel Marcel and the journal Esprit. So basically that's in conversation with people who want to think about Christianity, but also want to think about existentialism. So that's one of the early philosophical influences. But this early philosophy, as he's just getting started in his career, is punctuated by World War II. Ricoeur is a pacifist, he's openly pacifist, but is drafted into the French army. And he tells a story about being sent on patrol his first patrol, runs into a German soldier and is immediately captured. So that's his wartime experience. He never fires a gun, it seems, in his actual wartime experience. He spends 5 years as a prisoner of war, first in camp in Germany and then further east into Poland. That's a really famous experience of his. During this time in the camp, he gets a delivery from the Red Cross of books, and one of them is Husserl's Phenomenology, which he translates into French in the margins. It's really extraordinary. Hi, no problem, grab a seat. Scooch in here. Let me step up. So he gets this book, Husserl. I don't know why the Red Cross thought German phenomenology was the thing to send to prisoners of war in a camp, but that's what he got. And he and other philosophers who were in that camp embarked on a systematic program of education for other participants. And the University of France recognized that work as a formal degree at the end of the war. Yeah, it was really extraordinary. So it was a very peculiar kind of wartime experience. When he leaves that time, after the end of the war, he does return to academic life, returns to Marseille, returns to existentialism, has posts at Strasbourg, at the Sorbonne, and also then at Nanterre. We'll come back to Nanterre. His direct political experiences, I've said politics, the ethics is always important for him. His direct political experiences are varied. So before the war, he's socialist and he's pacifist. But after the war, he actually gets arrested in connection with his support for Algerian independence. They were suspecting him of sort of supporting weapons going to Algeria, so very uncharacteristic. That came to nothing. He became Dean of Nanterre. Nanterre was this project of public education, a new university. And he was dean during the period of May 1968. This is a period in French public life that was characterized by strike after strike after strike. And it began with some of the students in Nanterre. They were very influential in kickstarting the riots of that period. And there's a story that Ricoeur tells of going into one of the buildings that had been occupied by the students, and the students not giving him a good time, and he ends up with one of the litter bins put over his head. Not a good experience. But he also becomes very publicly dissatisfied with traditional university bureaucracy at this stage as well. And this combination of things leads him to resign this position in despair, and he goes instead to Chicago. So he takes up the chair that had been left vacant by the death of Paul Tillich. And this opens totally new philosophical horizons to him because he has an encounter there with analytical philosophy. As one sees in his later work, analytical philosophy becomes an important detour. So, for example, in his work on the ethics of self, other, and institution, he relies a lot on a detour through Derek Parfit's Puzzling Cases about the idea of the continuity of the self. He does not come to analytical conclusions, he's doing something else, but he's in that conversation, and that's a real change. Increasingly from that point, he actually enjoys a rising profile in France, and genuinely is a kind of, how should I put this, a public intellectual. He's part of the French cultural scene. Now, this biography, as I mentioned, is of value because it tells us some things about why Ricoeur is interested in the things that he's interested in. So he's an existentialist and he's a phenomenologist. So he's interested in the nature of human existence and of intentional existence. He's less interested, as a consequence of that focus, in questions of metaphysics. There's a very interesting reflection on, at the end of The Oneself, there's another collection where he says, effectively, he doesn't want to come to ontological conclusions, that that's a kind of totalizing. So he doesn't want to think about the nature of being as such. He thinks that that's an early 20th century and prior question. He wants to think about the phenomenology, the lived experience. And we see some of that, I think, in his approach in the symbolism of evil. And you'll see, I think, as well, this is a life marked early by the consequences of war. He grows up surrounded by French national narratives about war, and his abiding philosophical concern, especially in the first half of his career from which our texts come, was to account for the nature of the human will, that there is voluntary and involuntary features to this, and so to consider human fallibility, guilt, and a symbolic understanding of evil. Ooh, there we go. So that describes the first two bullet points on this slide, right? The context of existentialism, of phenomenology. He's interested in the lived experience, and his lived experience is marked by evil in various different ways. But existentialism can tip into the kind of tragic nihilistic approach. For Ricoeur, it was always a hopeful turn. The possibility that there is an original goodness in things was always on his horizon. We see that, I think, more in the hope essay. But nevertheless, even in this hopeful horizon, he's still interested in infallibility and guilt in the nature of evil. So it's a philosophy that takes seriously twin realities, the determined features of existence, but also acts that are genuinely free, the true initiative of the self. And that evil is present in both of those features, in both of those realities. But much of his later work, as it progresses, prioritizes the potential of human understanding and action to respond to those realities. So he writes a lot on politics, he writes a lot on how to write history effectively, on the genuine possibility of interpretation and of translation. The turn to hermeneutics, which is my subtitle for this, happens gradually, but is very present by the time he's moved to Chicago. And it dictates a lot of the work of that period. It's insufficient for him to work solely on a phenomenological level. He understands human persons to be always entangled. This is a word he takes from Wilhelm Schaap. Always entangled in cultural heritage, in narratives. This becomes very significant for how he understands the constitution of the self, for example. And we see this very much in the symbolism of evil. So he takes this hermeneutic turn. Have you heard the phrase, the hermeneutics of suspicion? This is something that's come across. A hermeneutics of suspicion is when one approaches a text thinking there is something deliberate at play here that I need to attend to. So, for example, feminist biblical interpretation will often take a hermeneutics of suspicion stance because they're concerned about the way that male and female dynamics will show up in that text. It's Ricoeur who coins that phrase, hermeneutics of suspicion. But he goes beyond that. He doesn't want to stay at this level of what is this author's agenda? What has happened to this text? Rather, he wants to encounter the text in a fresh way. We see some of that, I think, in the symbolism of evil. But what I'm explaining here is that this commitment to interpretation, that there is interpretive work to be done always in response to the other, in response to the text, in response to any idea, that is the dominating methodology of his career from the 1950s onwards. He's also very committed to distinctions between philosophy proper, as he would call it, versus theology, which he thinks is sort of a mixed up discipline that isn't necessarily very worthwhile, versus listening to a religious text. He does philosophy and he does listening to texts. He does not do theology. So in that sense, he is a bit different, I think, from, say, someone like Marion, who is, I think, more theological. And this is partly because in the French Academy, there was a great deal of suspicion about Ricoeur as a believer, right? He's becoming a philosopher at a time when religion is really out of fashion as a philosophical question. His contemporaries some are still interested in religion, like Marcel, but many of the people who populate the Sorbonne and Strasbourg and so on are very suspicious about religion. So he's reacting to this criticism in the French Academy a lot of the time in keeping separate his philosophy that he thinks is systematic versus reading a biblical text. We might talk a bit more about that because I think it comes up in a very important way methodologically in the Symbolism of Evil essay that we've read together. But that's where that's coming from. And as I mentioned, he's prolific. So for those who missed it, this is just a list of things that Ricoeur has written and things people have written about Ricoeur, and it's already 13, 14 years out of date. And it's enormous. So, prolific. Right, what I'm going to do now is give you an overview of some key works of Ricoeur, and this will give you a sense of the development of his thinking. So, we might think about Ricoeur's work as a successive blossoming. Each text opens up a question, and he has to then answer a further question in the next work. That's how we might think of it. So new questions, sort of, to use a metaphor, bud at the close of each focus study, and that blooms into the next text. This is one of the first systematic works, Philosophie de la Volonté, the voluntary and the involuntary. It's often published in English under the title Freedom and Nature, but voluntary and involuntary is a better characterization. Ricoeur intended this as the first of a trilogy that would focus on the human will. The voluntary and the involuntary is the first piece. The second is finitude and culpability. So he's moving here from the voluntary and the involuntary, a kind of phenomenological question, to what is finitude versus what is culpability. So already a philosophy of religion question that's shaped as potentially ethical. This second volume is actually published as two separate books, just to be really confusing. One is called Fallible Man, and the second is The Symbolism of Evil. So the Symbolism of Evil introduction and conclusion that we've read for today is the second part of the second volume of a trilogy about the human will and about where evil comes from. The third book in the trilogy was going to be a poetics of the will, which Ricoeur never wrote. The question that bloomed out of the Symbolism of Evil became about the nature of symbol itself. So from here, he turns instead to questions of metaphor, of hermeneutics as such, the very philosophy of interpretation, to more essays about interpretation, to the connection between text and action, and the specific problem of biblical interpretation. And from there, he goes to a text, Fond et Récit, 3 volumes, actually complete trilogy this time, translated as Time and Narrative. And this is where he begins to make the connection between hermeneutics as an interesting thing to do with a text or philosophically, to connect it instead with things that people actually do. Time and Narrative is interested in history writing, what it means to narrate, what it means to be creatures who live in time and narrate. And that feeds in then to his great ethical work, Soi-même comme un autre, or Oneself as Another. Oneself as Another are his Gifford lectures. He delivers 12 Gifford lectures about the nature of the self. And as I mentioned, for Ricoeur, the self is entangled always in relationships with the other, with institutions, but also crucially with stories, with symbols, with cultural heritages that have meaning. We see some of that in the Symbolism of Evil essay, in his interest in contingent systems of symbols. But this is an ethical turn for Ricoeur. What is the ethical consequence of understanding the self in this way? And from there, his work considers questions of justice, ongoing work with biblical interpretation, what it means to recognize the other as an ethical question, topics to do with translation, and again, a return to the great epic work that was published just a year or so before he died on memory, history, and forgetting, the ethical question of history writing. It's another mammoth text. It's about 1.5 inches thick. And interesting piece of trivia, Emmanuel Macron was his research assistant on that book. So there you go. There's an interesting connection with current French governance. But our texts come from this period, the period where he's realized that he can't do a philosophy of evil without paying attention to symbols. That's the Symbolism of Evil. And this period in Chicago, he's interacting with lots of theologically minded people like David Tracy. He's in the legacy of Paul Tillich because of the chair that he's in. So he's spending a lot of time thinking about interpretation as such, but also this distinction always between what counts as philosophy versus what counts as listening to a biblical text. Never does he say he is doing theology, so we must distinguish that. So he's interested in symbolism and interpretation and in disciplinary distinctions. We see that coming up again and again in the pieces that we've read. Now, it is important for Ricoeur that religion shows up in his work. This is a quotation of his from an interview that was conducted. The interviews are collected in a text called Critique and Conviction. I have always walked on 2 legs, he says. It is not only for methodological reasons that I do not mix genres, it is because I insist on affirming a 2-fold reference. This is absolutely primary for me. The legs in that metaphor are listening to religious texts and philosophy. They're different tasks, but he can't do his work without both of them. And this is what we see argued for in the Symbolism of Evil, why it is valuable to make a move through symbol to do philosophical work, but not to confuse the two. If you try to turn 2 legs into 1 leg, you just fall over. So Ricoeur, the listener, is important to contextualize as well. When he's using religious texts, very often relying solely on the Christian appropriation of Hebrew and Greek texts. He does not have expertise in other religious traditions, and even the language that we see in the Symbolism of Evil essays, the we and the our, is very much a Western audience. And this is something where I think Ricoeur is very much a modern. He's interested in the global and in intercultural encounter. That was very important for his ideas about translation, but he sees himself as in a contingent place. He's been formed by what is going on in French philosophy. That's where his roots are. So he doesn't pretend to expertise beyond his own contingency. Nevertheless, he has this inner conviction. He's a believer, right? He's a Christian. He does not want that in his philosophy. He wants his philosophy to be distinct and separate, and yet he still wants to pay attention to the Bible. And this is what he says about it. He talks about, he says it actually in the Symbolism of Evil text, we take a wager when we decide what texts to pay attention to. We're taking a risk. We're taking a bet. And we're betting that that text is useful for our thinking. That's the wager that he's making. And this is his wager. How do I avoid the famous circle of believing in order to understand, and understanding in order to believe? This is the vicious circle of hermeneutics, right? I do not seek to avoid it, he says. I boldly stay within this circle in the hope that through the transfer from text to life, what I've risked will be returned 100-fold as an increase in comprehension, valour, and joy. So Ricoeur says, I'm taking a risk, I'm taking a wager. My wager is there's something fruitful and important in the Christian heritage, specifically in the biblical text that is like a kernel or a seed at the heart of a community of interpretation. He's less interested in the theology. He's very interested in the central text that has inspired the community. So that's his risk, that there will be a transfer from that biblical text into life that is worthwhile, that is different from his philosophy, and we'll need to think about whether we agree with him that he keeps it sufficiently separate from his philosophy. So this is all context for our texts, and that's where I want to spend most of our time today. We have an essay that is focusing on disciplinary distinctions with the example of hope. An essay that tells a story about how hope shows up in Western philosophy, paying particular attention to Hegel and Kant, but then also how it operates not theologically, but in the religious narratives of Christianity. The symbolism of evil is giving you the methodological background for some of that. We have only the intro and the conclusion. If you're interested in the question of symbolic representations of evil, by all means read the rest. But what the intro and conclusion are doing is giving the methodological claim that he's making, specifically that a detour through a symbol can be philosophically fruitful without necessarily theologizing from the symbol. What the symbol reveals is more important. So hopefully that gives you some context for what we've encountered so far. We might engage with some of these bullet points to make sense of hope as the structure of philosophical systems and the content of hope. But we'll come on to those if and when they come up in our conversation. So for the sake of the recording, I'm going to pause here, and this will be available to you if you ever need to go back and check on something that I have said. There we go. Although that's ticking along, it's not recording anymore, just so you know. So it, as it says, it automatically cuts it from the recording. So if you haven't seen this tool before, it's what we use to capture conversation in classrooms, but not you guys. So you can say anything you like. It won't be captured in the recording. We'll come back to this if it's useful. What I am interested in is, firstly, does that account of Ricoeur leave you with any general questions that you want to raise? And if not, we're going to get into the texts.
I just realized that I made a mistake in my midterm paper already, because I was writing about Heidegger, and I mentioned a little bit about his influence on Ricoeur, but I said that it's within theology, but then I realized that it's not theology.
Yeah.
Because we have a text in Islamic studies, What is Islam? It says that actually when he's saying the hermeneutical engagement within the Islamic studies, it's also the author is borrowing methods from Ricoeur, so I thought
that's really cool.
Yeah.
Who is the person who is using Ricoeur for a study of Islam? Shahab. I would love to read that. There are lots of theologians who use Ricoeur, so that connection does make sense. But he thinks that there is something different from the narratives, the symbols, for example, of a originating text, which for him would be the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament. His argument is those symbols reveal something at the existential level, the things that have really concerned humanity in a primordial way. And yes, then Christian theologians come along and come up with doctrines and structures of teaching that relate to that, but that's a rationalization of something more fundamental. And their starting point is within that circle of belief. And that's not what he thinks a philosopher is for. A philosopher has to also be able to step away and think about the first principles, effectively, of philosophy. And we see a slightly different approach in the hope as the structure of philosophical systems, because there it becomes the question of the ending point becomes relevant, which is a little different. So we may say some more about that. So it's not inappropriate for someone to use recur theologically. It's just not what he would call his own work. Yeah, that's the key thing. So you've got to explain how and why you're using recur if you want to do that. Good. Any other general questions on recur and where he is coming from?
I mean, the center of theology is basically the text of theology. So he's really focusing on the text. So he is doing theology, but he's not basically attributing himself to a certain theology of other thinkers. Is that what it is? As in he's using his own hermeneutics and making his own conclusions. Is that what he's doing? Or?
That's a great question. He definitely does not want to be identified with a particular school of theology. There's an essay on biblical interpretation in this collection where he says that churches often treat teaching as if it's revelation, as opposed to the text. So he does not want to be doing that. He does not want to be offering any kind of definitive claim about the theological meaning of what's in the text. What he is willing to do is say, this is a text that talks about, for example, in Symbolism of Evil, the symbol of sin and the symbol of stain and guilt. He really explicitly says he's not interested in the way that the Christian church has turned that into a doctrine of original sin. He thinks that's pseudo-philosophy. So that's like treating the symbol as if it just says something that's true about the human person, rather than indicating a kind of shared experience. So the theologian treats it as true. And he doesn't want to go that far. He does want to say there could be something meaningful here, so I am going to pay attention to it. But he isn't trying to come to Christian doctrine. That's not the kind of outcome he's aiming at. So I think that would be his justification, that he's not theologizing. Whether or not you find that persuasive is a different matter. So
he's still doing hermeneutics here, and that's exactly what all the other theologians within the Christianity and whatever text you basically, they're doing the same thing. Where they're reaching their conclusion, he's reaching his. So it's like let's say a mystical kind of approach to the text.
Oh, interesting. Tell me a bit more about why you would describe it as mystical.
Because he's not taking the let's say what's so apparent with what is being said. So he's trying to see what he can understand through that text, through a different interpretation that's not not so apparent. Basically, it's like more hidden, more kind of understanding of it itself.
He certainly wants to get to a deeper layer. So in this, in the Symbolism of Evil example, he talks about the difference between a myth and a symbol, for example. And the myth is what you get on the surface of the text. It's the story that's being told. So in the Genesis narrative, it's about the creation, and it's about the snake coming to Eve and telling her to eat the fruit and so on. So it's a narrative, it's a myth. He thinks the symbol is the hidden meaning underneath. So I think in that sense, the idea of going deeper, spot on. Whether or not that's mystical, I don't know, because for him it isn't, his hermeneutical task isn't one of faith. It isn't one about being in relationship with the God that the text is naming. It's about trying to get at the human primordial worry that is underneath it. And the worry is, I've experienced evil and I don't know where it comes from. There's defilement, there might be guilt, there might be sin. These symbols are at play. So the myth becomes a way of, he calls them elsewhere myths of commencement, where things have come from, where humans have come from, where evil has come from. If you think about the myth of the Tower of Babel. Have you come across this before? Humanity builds a tower in Genesis 11, I think it is, and they're trying to get up to heaven. That's the myth. And they're doing really well. And God's like, I don't like this. and destroys the tower and fractures people's languages. So now everyone in the project is speaking a different language and they can no longer work well together. Some people read that as like a punishment myth, but he reads it as a, how do we explain why we're different from each other? Or maybe it's this sort of story. So he's not reading that as something that's really true. He's reading it as a way of describing this, I keep using this word primordial, this underlying question about why humans are the way that they are and the things that they're worried about. So I'm hesitant about mystical specifically, but I think you're absolutely spot on about this idea of what is the thing underneath? What is the opaque meaning here? I guess one of the differences between that as a listener versus that as a theologian is that he doesn't want to teach it for Christian purposes. So he is trying to get at something philosophical, but you're not alone in thinking, actually, this is just theology. So you might find it useful to look at this book. This is quite a recent one that's come out. Barney Asprey's book, because Asprey reads Ricoeur's early work. He sort of stops at the symbolism of evil in this. It's just about his early work and effectively says, there's something theological going on in here in Ricoeur's work about the original goodness of creation. So if you're struggling with Ricoeur, or if you just want to learn more, or if you want some support for reading him theologically, Asprey is your guy. So you're definitely not alone in that reading, for sure. Any other general questions before we turn maybe to the essays?
I just want to confirm. Does it mean that you say that Ricoeur wants to encounter text in the fresh way, right? And also he stands on the two legs, meaning listening to religious texts and also philosophy. Does it mean that Ricoeur wants to reproduce or reinterpret something in the a new interpretation when it comes to religious text, for example?
That's a good question. He wants to encounter the text as if it is new to him. There's a phrase in the conclusion that will not have made sense to you because he explains it somewhere else. But he talks about something called the second naivete. Does that ring a bell from your reading for this week? I'm going to try and find it. Exactly where it is. I will track it down later and make sure you have a page number for it. So page 352, if you ever need that reference, in Symbolism of Evil. When we first read a text, we're in the first naivete. Oh, what is this text about? Oh, it's a story. That's lovely. Maybe the story means that God created the world. And then we get critical and we think about historical context and what the story is trying to do. And if one is in theological training, one might go through doctrine and history and all sorts of other disciplines. But to really read this as a text that is at the heart of a community of belief or a community of interpretation, you have to come to it in a second naivete. Yes, you have your critical apparatus now, but you have to listen to the text. So Ricoeur always refers to himself as a listener of the text. And there should always, therefore, be something astonishing, a new encounter, a new insight. In practice, when we read some of the essays, the listening essays of Ricoeur, he's not necessarily saying anything very revolutionary. For example, he has a chapter about interpreting the story of the Good Samaritan, which is a parable from one of the Gospels, which is a story that Jesus tells about who is my neighbour. It's the man who stops and helps the person at the side of the road who's been beaten by thieves. the Pope, the current Pope, has just quoted that essay in one of his encyclicals. But it's not saying anything very new, right? It's just saying, yeah, you should neighbour to people. It's good to go and be the person who helps. So there's nothing really astonishing, actually, in that particular interpretation. So it isn't about having a new interpretation for the sake of being radical or unusual. It's about being open to the possibility of a new meaning in the text. Does that make sense? Yeah. He, in a similarly timed, oh gosh, I've got to go back through all my amazing moves now. Yeah, in that book there, translated as The Rule of Metaphor in English, he talks about the way a metaphor can do that new thinking for you. If I just said, oh, the sky is like sapphires, that is a very trite image. Lots of people have called the sky sapphires. It's the colour of these jewels, it's beautiful. I don't tell you anything new about the sky if I use a metaphor like that. If I use an unexpected metaphor, suddenly you might think about the sky in a new way. That's his idea. There's this positing of a possible reality that comes with a metaphor. So you're not wrong, I think, to see him as someone who thinks that the idea of a new connection or a new idea can refresh things in an important way. And that is the task of a reader. A reader should always be doing creative work in relation to a text. But it's always in relation to the text. You can't just make it up. So yeah, good question. Anything else more generally before we might turn to the texts? We've already been doing lots of text stuff already, so we're doing well. Okay, I thought we might start with, I'm just going to keep an eye on the time so you guys get a little bit of a break as well. I thought we might start with hope and the structure of philosophical systems, because he mentions Hegel and Kant, who I think you guys have been encountering earlier in the program. So I think that would be very interesting to see what you made of his account of Hegel and Kant, because it's quite, don't know if it's necessarily relating well to stuff that you've worked on before. So, as I mentioned at the very beginning, in case you missed it, these structured reading questions are, I think they're interesting. You might not think they're interesting. We can discuss other things in the texts. Okay, so we'll start with these, but if you have nothing to say on them, that's fine. I can hear just what you found interesting in the texts themselves. And forgive me, I'm losing my voice, I'm afraid. It just means you guys need to say lots of interesting things. So, freedom and the structure of philosophical systems. Suggested first question, that in this essay, Ricoeur says he's seeking an understanding of the finishing point rather than the starting point of philosophy. Why do you think that's interesting? It's not necessarily related to the context stuff that I've set up. It's not a test. Just why would you think that would be interesting philosophically?
I think that the whole point of phenomenology is that you don't reach a finishing point. You just keep on being bewildered by philosophy. So I don't understand what he means by finishing point. Is he trying to just get to an answer? Because it doesn't seem to be that his style, if he's always doing hermeneutics.
Yeah, very well observed. Very well observed. I think that's absolutely spot on. So finishing point might mean something different here. Having read the essay, does he come to a finishing point, do you think?
I think he doesn't explain it further in the essay regarding the finishing point. Just simply give the introduction about finishing, but I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
What does it mean by finishing point?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. He's got some numbered points at the end. That's great. And I think it's because this finishing point that he's talking about here Another word he uses for it is horizon. Well, you never reach the horizon. So it's exactly as you were saying, this finishing point is imaginary. It's always beyond the horizon. You can keep walking and the horizon just recedes, right? And this is what is at play for him, I think, in this essay. Hope is his finishing point, but very precisely, that is always future-oriented. In the philosophical part of this frame, it becomes something that Kant posits. It's not a starting point. He has to imagine it to get the rest of his philosophy to work. He has to imagine the possibility that humans can will for the good. He has to imagine the possibility that humans will for the good. So he's describing a horizon, something that's imagined to get the rest of his philosophy to work. You can't philosophize that precisely because it lies in human freedom. In the religious side, it's stories about the end of time. It's stories about, in the Christian tradition, which is often his reference point, it's a story about the new creation, about resurrection, about the possibility of life after death. These are hopeful stories. They are not the same thing that Kant is doing, but they're both kind of hoped for horizons. So your confusion on this point is a really good critical reaction, because it isn't a finishing point at all. It's this horizon. It's the place where both religion and philosophy kind of have to give up. That's it. That's as far as they can go. Then it's just hope. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Nevertheless, why might he be interested in that rather than starting point, do you think? There's no sort of specifically right answer here. I just think it's really an interesting project that he's embarking on, and I'm wondering what you make of it.
You mentioned he was very existentialist kind of perspective, so he wants to see how we can use things now, here, and the now, not what's history. Starting point would be something in the past, and it's not very useful to now, maybe. Maybe one aspect.
I think that's a really fair answer. And one of the reasons I would go with that, right? I think that makes sense, because he seems to be rejecting here philosophical accounts that think they can just start, right? They can just account for everything. He's interested here instead in the unfulfilled claim. And I think that's really, I struggle with it, basically, is what I'm saying, because at the same time, in the symbolism of evil, he says that the only place you can start is in contingent context, where you happen to be in your time, in your place, which is where the phenomenological kind of entry point comes from. So it's a really interesting apparent tension, I think, methodologically, between the two pieces that we've read, that we may not fully resolve, I think, in this conversation. How do you think, or what do you think maybe, about his handling of Hegel and his handling of Kant? Did you recognize the Hegel and the Kant, or the accounts of Hegel and Kant that he gave in this essay? And just to reassure you, I do not know Hegel very well at all. And my understanding of Kant is through Ricoeur. So you guys are the experts in this particular area. And partly used this text because I knew you would have encountered some of this. And I'm really wondering if Ricoeur is right in his account here. And I'm wondering what you think about it. Let's try a more specific entry point. What does he say in this essay is the problem with Hegel, do you think?
Absolute knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Spot on. And specifically that there is always the unfulfilled claim when one is tackling topics of the actualization of human freedom, right? So this provisionality that I was talking about with respect to ontology remains methodologically important for Ricoeur here. So yeah, well observed. The issue is that Hegel thinks he can do absolute knowledge, according to Ricoeur's reading of Hegel. Yeah, good. And so we get to Kant. Why do we go to Kant if the problem with Hegel is absolute knowledge?
Limits. The limits.
Yeah, limits. That's Kant's entire deal. Limits.
Yeah.
And we have this on page 211 if you need the reference point for it. Kant is the philosopher who thought about the limits of knowledge and of action, and who linked the possibility of a philosophy of hope to this meditation. So hope for Kant appears as a way of hoping, as it were, of thinking past the limits, but taking the limits seriously. It keeps open the thinking rather than closing the system. So anything that totalizes, anything that suggests it's got a definitive answer, for Ricoeur, that's bad philosophy. And so we see why a hermeneutic turn becomes so important for him, because hermeneutics is precisely that philosophy that cannot be closed. There is always this ongoing interpretive work, exactly as you were saying earlier. There's a never-ending quality to interpretive hermeneutical work, and that's what he thinks is right for philosophy as well. Which is a bit tiring, but maybe reassuring, because it means you don't have to have a definitive answer to everything. And that is where he's different from doctrine, right? To continue our discussion about the disciplinary distinctions, Christian doctrine is absolutely about getting some solid answers, because that will then shape what's going on in ecclesial context and churches and so on. And that for Ricoeur is, ultimately, it's authoritarian. He doesn't want part of it. So, different purposes. Good, excellent, in fact. This is such a mean question, I regret asking it. What does this essay achieve philosophically? Yeah, go on, just give me a full critique of an entire complex essay. If that's a horrifying question, although I'd be very interested if you have an answer to it, I would just be interested in asking you what you thought of the essay, what you thought was interesting about it, what struck you about it. Whether it's something that did not work for you or something that you thought was good.
From what I've read from this article, he wants to argue separation between duty from desire, universality from historicity, because he thinks that between universality from historicity, for example, cannot be separated. Is it true?
I think that's spot on. But give me the last word again, sorry, and what you were saying.
Universality from historicity, legality from effectiveness, rationality from reality.
Yeah, excellent. So the distinction between the universal and the historical it's actually the title of another essay of his very late on in the collection on justice. And he's constantly grappling with philosophy's attempt to say something truthful about reality, but the contingent place of the philosopher. So when Ricoeur tries to philosophize, he wants to be doing it without assumptions. That's how he wants to do it, and so be universal. So he's thoroughly modern in this sense, right? Not for him the kind of Derridan postmodernity. He thinks you can universalize, but there's always an intersecting tension with the historical, hence why his philosophy is never done.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a really good insight. I hadn't clocked that was as significant as it was in the structure essay, but I think you're absolutely spot on. Very good. What do you guys think of that claim Do you think you can reason university ever? Nice easy question for a Monday afternoon.